Hi, my name's Susan Rainey, and I'm putting together a short, kind of a resource video for the people taking my Hito class at BeWoolen in Champlin. And I thought this way it could be there for people to look back on when they're home and kind of have questions about how to do the next step. So we have knit our rectangle, we have both sleeves, we have our provisional cast on, and we are now going to do the 3-needle bind off that we do to join the bottom of the sleeves. So what we have is, if you notice, we have our short chain, and that's the chain that we're going to work with first, and we are going to remove those stitches. And the way I do it is typically I put my needle into the stitches before I pull the provisional cast on, but I'm going to do it stitch by stitch this time. So you unhook the chain. Depending on how you did this, it might be on either end, but for our purposes, it should be on this end. And the way you know which one to unravel is you see the chain and it looks like a stitch going up, and you can remove that tail and start pulling the stitches out. If you are at the other end, you look and you see the bottom of a stitch and a knot, and you can't take it off from that end. So we are going to use a different needle. I'm using a size couple of needles smaller than what I knit my sleeves with, and I'm going to start pulling this out until I get to my first stitch. And here's my first stitch, and I'm going to put it on the needle before I pull the waste yarn out. I'm going to try to do that anyway. You want to make sure you capture that stitch before you take the waste yarn out. So now I'm going to put that under here. I'm going to take that one. And what I'm doing is, as I get to each stitch, I'm kind of lifting up on that waste yarn so I can see the stitch, and then I insert, and this is my slip stitch. That's why it looks funny, because I was doing slip stitches on the edge. So that's not really a stitch. So each one, I get to that stitch, I insert it into the stitch, and I keep going one by one. Now these are my ribbing stitches, so they're alternating knit purl, and we're seeing them from the other direction, so that's why they look funny. Now once I have those on here, and now we're just doing regular stockinette, I'll show you how I insert my needle. I go stitch by stitch into those stitches, into the right leg, and then I can pull several off. Now mine is kind of catching because what I did for this Hito, this is the 6th one I've made, the 3rd one for myself, and so I wanted one that was a little different than the ones I've made, and so I added Kid Silk's to my yarn, so I have double yarn, so that's why mine's a little thicker, and that's why it's fuzzy, and that's also why it's sticking. So anyway, you just keep going until you get to the end of these, and you should have the number that you cast on. So in my case, I have 66 stitches, and that's because I had I'm making a size large, and I added 12 stitches for the length, to add length to the sleeve, and so I should end up with 66 stitches on this needle. So the next step, I just got all my stitches on my needle. The first thing I did is I counted my stitches, and I did find out that this little guy was a real stitch, so that counted as my 66. I also found up here one that was twisted the other way. So you want to make sure they're all seated on the needle correctly with the right leg to the front. And so now I have my 66 stitches. They all look good. But the thing I'm going to do right now is I'm going to insert a lifeline into the side that I took off the waste yarn. And the reason I'm doing this is if I have to rip back. When you rip back 3 needle bind off, you have 2 sets of live stitches being unraveled at the same time. So the one I'm worried about is the one that I started from the bottom, because these stitches, when you see them from the other direction, look funny and they're hard to pick up correctly. So I want to make sure that when if I have to rip back, these are safe and secure and I don't have to worry about them. The ones on the regular working end, I'm not worried about because I can always get those back on the needle. But if you feel a little less confident about that, you could do a lifeline on both sets of live stitches. And that way, if you make a mistake, if you want to rip back, you can just take out the needle or, start unraveling it. You don't have to worry about the stitches going anywhere. So how do you do a lifeline? Well, I use waste yarn. So here's some very nice white cotton waste yarn. You put it on a blunt tapestry needle. And you just weave it through the stitches as they are. So you insert from left or right to left on all of them and just go right along the cable. You try not to split anything. Hopefully you don't split anything because that would probably cause a problem later. I don't know. And you just go under each of these stitches until you get to the other side. So that would be my waste yarn. When I'm knitting it, I just ignore that. That's why you want a fairly thin waste yarn, and you want something that's a contrast color so that you don't get mixed up with what you're doing. And you just thread that through all of your stitches. Whoops. Excuse that jiggle. And so that's how you do it's called a lifeline. That's how you do a lifeline. So do that on either just this side or both sides. That's your preference. So now I'm all ready to go. I have my lifeline in here, and I've just cut it off, put a little knot on the end just so it doesn't go back through. You ignore that as you're knitting. And what I'm going to do is a stretchy 3 needle bind off, because I would like to have a little bit of give in the sleeve. The regular bind off does not have any stretch at all. If you notice on here, you pull, it just has no give whatsoever. And when you're wearing it, you like to be able to pull it down and have a little bit of ease there. I'm not going to start the beginning of this where the ribbing is with the stretchy bind off, because that makes it a little bit too wide. I want to kind of keep that compressed because that gives us our nice edge. You have to make sure that you have, the same exact number of stitches on both pieces that you are joining together. So you have, the reason they call it 3 needle bind off is you have 3 needles. We have stitches on the back needle. We have the same number of stitches on the front needle. And then I have a 3rd needle, and that's the needle I will use to knit the stitches off. I sometimes use a needle that's one size larger if I'm going to do a regular 3 needle bind off. With a stretchy bind off, sometimes you'd actually go down a needle size because it does make the stitches a little bit bigger. And that's why I'm going to start the first 6 stitches with regular 3 needle bind off, so I don't have that kind of enlarged thing going on there. We have our yarn already attached. And so I'm just going to start my knitting. I go into the first stitch on the front needle, and don't catch your lifeline. I go into the first stitch on the second needle, and I knit those together as if they were one stitch. I end up with 1 stitch. Then I do that to the next 2, the next one on the front needle, the next stitch on the back needle, and I knit those 2 together. and I just pass that over, just like a regular bind off. This is number 2. Regular bind off into the 3rd. Into the 4th. 5. Just pass it over like a regular bind off. And this is 6. So that's my last ribbing. And like I said, I just didn't want that to flare. Let's just see what that looks like. So you can see that it has kept the width of our edge and looks nice. And now we're going to do the stretchy bind off for the remainder. And you start off the same way. You just knit the 2 next stitches together. And now we do essentially like an SSK, where you insert your needle into the front of those 2 stitches and knit them together instead of passing the stitch over. And that's what gives it that little bit of stretch. So I knit the next 2. And insert either one, whichever is the most comfortable, into those. For me, I have to catch all my yarn. And you just keep going. So into the next 2 on both needles, into the front, knit 2 together like an SSK. Knit the 2 together, into the front, knit them like an SSK. And you can see already, you see this little dot right here? That's the hallmark of the stretchy bind off. You can see the stitches seem bigger than the regular bind off. I hope you can see that. And they are definitely stretchier, and when we get it done, I'll show you how the stretch works. So I'm done with my 3 needle bind off. You can see I still have my waste yarn, and you can see the difference here when you look at the first set of stitches and then as I got into the stretchy part. What I did, and I'm really glad I put in my lifeline, because what I did is I felt that once I started going, I thought it looked too loose. So I ripped back and redid the stretchy part with a needle that is 1 size smaller. So I used a 6 instead of the 7. I'm knitting this on a 7. The other thing I did is when I got to the end, I just put the last stitch on a little holder here so that I can manipulate this a little bit and show you. She has you bind off, like in my case I had 66 stitches, she has you bind off 65, and that uses up all 66 stitches, but only 65 are bound off. So if I turn this right side out, and I will at some point show this to you without the waste yarn. I don't want to take that out right now because I might need it. I mean, you just never know. But you can see that this is joined. Everything lines up. It's a very neat, well, let's see, I'll take some of it out. It looks very neat, and it is stretchy. It has that little bit of give. So next step is she tells you to, and I'm going to put this back inside out again. So it looks like it's going to when you are done. So I have live stitches on my sweater. The rest of my stitches are still here, and I have this one stitch that I just put on a holder just for us. I'm going to put that back on the needle, and then she says to place a marker. So we are right here. It says use 3 needle bind off. Now this is where, if you added stitches to your sleeve, this is where you would need to add them here, because your stitch count will be different than what's listed on the pattern page. So I had 66 instead of 54, and so I bound off 65. It says 1 stitch remains on your right needle, place marker, knit to end. And as you see, with it turned inside out like it is, the right side is facing you. So for me, I will put the stitch back on the needle. That's my 1 stitch that's remaining. I will add a marker, and I will knit across the row. And I will knit all the way to the end of the other sleeve. And she says knit. She doesn't tell you to work in ribbing at the last 6, but I probably will. So anyway, I will just knit across to the other side of that row. So now I have knit across that entire row. So I'm at the end of my other sleeve. Now this is where I asked you in class to mark when you did your provisional cast on. Mark where that sleeve portion would be. Here's the back from here to here. Here is the sleeve from here to here. I also, on my way back, I marked my sleeve as I was knitting back. I just looked where it would be lined up. I didn't do any counting. So that's my sleeve. With this end, if you notice, to unravel it, this is the wrong end. See that? I have to unravel it from this other end. Yours may be different, but you just unravel it from whichever end needs to be unraveled from. And so when I use a circular needle, I'll be able to put all the stitches across here, and my end will be where it's supposed to be. So it really doesn't matter which end you unravel it from. So you just simply unravel that entire strip, you put that on a needle, and then you come back, you'll have your second needle in position. You have your 66, in my case, stitches marked, and then you bind those off. You have the 1 stitch extra, and you place the marker again. And so that would finish up this part of the sweater joining process. And when that happens, this is where it gets really crazy, is you end up with a big circle. And this is where you start knitting in the round just for a short amount of time. And let's look ahead to that. You do now you've just got kind of the back, and I don't know, it's, I guess, up around the neck. It's kind of odd to describe. You have a certain number of stitches on there, and you do 1 by 1 ribbing. But please note where it says the 1 by 1 ribbing, it says for shoulder and waist, work in the round, you knit 1, purl 1, and then you purl 2 together here. Okay, so you do need to make sure you pay attention to that.